My name is Sasha Poquet. I'm a researcher at the Center for Change and Complexity in Learning at the UniSA. So I had a very unconventional trajectory. I have been an English language teacher for a bit of time, and then I moved towards non-formal education, where I mostly worked with social experiences that people have and how that transforms their views and attitudes. And that was about the time where massive open online courses were sort of picking up. And I was interested in understanding how all that experience that I've had working with groups in face-to-face settings would translate into a digital space. And so that I went to do a PhD in learning analytics. So I'll speak a little bit about teaching first. As somebody who has had experience teaching in a classroom, I think of it back as that, well, you know, my teaching doesn't really differ in terms of how I approach it, right? I want to know what the students are doing, who is interacting with whom, what kind of problems they're having, what kind of problems they're discussing, where I can come and help them, how do I structure learning activities. So all of these things don't change from setting to setting for me. I always think of the tools, regardless of face-to-face or digital. But what happens when when a lot of the learning and in groups is mediated by technology is that seeing these things that are so easy to see in a face-to-face setting, that picture doesn't emerge immediately in a digital space. And so that's where learning analytics becomes handy. So when I do my own teaching, I basically look at the log data of what my students are doing. I find it particularly important to look at the time when they look at things, because I teach adult learners. University students are busy people. So it's important for me to understand their rhythms when they interact with the course, and sort of what things they pick up easier and what things are more sort of hard coming for them, so they take time to engage with those things. So that's my direct use of basically looking at the dashboard, simple statistics telling me which student looked at what resource, how much, who's lagging behind, whether I need to basically give people more time to interact with weekly content rather than giving them more, whether I need to adjust assessments because they haven't interacted with the content that is with assessment that's coming up. So I find that learning analytics provides that understanding that I would otherwise get at a snapshot in a classroom, so it's much faster in a face-to-face environment, while learning analytics supports that in teaching. When it comes to my research, I study social environments, so as I said, and that doesn't mean that I necessarily focus on collaborative learning. People always think, oh, well, interactions is when people solve problems together. To me, all learning is socially situated, meaning that we always are situated in groups, and those groups of people, their composition, what matters to those groups around us has effect on what we do. So I study networks of learners in digital spaces, and learning analytics is handy there because basically you can't know and you can't see without looking at what the data traces portray. Right, so I'll talk about the first one that I was trying to address when I just got into the field. So as I noted earlier, I was working with communities of learners in face-to-face settings. So really experiential learning experiences, experiential learning kind of contexts. And when I started looking at online environments, a lot of people were very critical of whether socio-emotional processes underpin learning at all in, for instance, in massive open online courses, because you have thousands of learners coming together and basically it's a big mess, and if people start interacting in large groups, then all things fall apart. So it's much easier not to have a social experience because communities don't form, period. And so the problem I was solving was I was trying to use data to understand whether that's actually true, and whether there are communities in large courses like that, and what those communities look like and how they develop. And so what I found was that there are in fact communities that evolve in open, distributed online learning environments. But those communities are not the same type, and they don't follow the same processes as the ones that we're conventionally used to in a small group setting or in a classroom, if you like. Even in university courses, communities don't evolve under the same processes. Put it simply, is when you're forming a community in a class, in a university course, it's important that students establish bonds with one another. So it's a relationship between a person and a person, and so those bonds help them increase their commitment and engagement and participation. And so we can understand that by looking at the log data, by building networks of people, and then looking at how those networks evolve over time and how those ties are sustained and what sort of discourse underpins those ties, because then we can see that there are social things that are important to this bond-based community formation. Now, in open online courses, we don't have bonds, but communities form through engagement with common interests. So people form attachment to the common cause or common problem, and so an online educator can then design the course around those shared interests, which will increase the socio-emotional attachment of the learners and help them form groups that will discuss things. So it's still socio-emotional process, it's still community, but if you look at the way the networks unfold, what discourse underpins, and when these sort of discussions that relate to social formation processes in groups of learning happen, that wouldn't be the same in a MOOC as it is in a university course, for instance. So learning analytics helped me unpack this using large-scale data. That was the first problem I solved. I think that right now there are a lot of talks about sort of the impact of learning analytics. And to me, the most useful application of learning analytics is the ability to engage a teacher or a learner with a critical reflection process. So as a researcher in this area, I don't necessarily agree with the prescriptive approaches that say, well, we're going to tell you what's going to happen. I think the more interesting applications, and now there are some scholars talking about it, is that we might know what will happen, but we want to change those patterns. So the dashboards and the snapshots of what's happening that learning analytics can portray is good for then for a teacher to ask, well, is that what I want? Is that my end goal? What do I change in here? Why do I observe these things? What will happen if I change something in my design or if I regroup the learners here? And it's the same for the learner. If the learner is shown their own progress and the learner is told that if they want to basically achieve a particular goal, they are not on track to that goal, they can reflect whether that's important to them and then act upon it, or basically ignore it because maybe that's not, bridging that gap is not of relevance to them at the moment. So to me, that's the real benefit. I can give another example. So one of the K-12 settings work that I've done was with a group in Singapore. They've developed this social annotation tool. And basically, it's a reading application that allows children to work with texts at home, and it allows them to ask questions and interact about the text using little scaffolds. So like the type of, you ask a question and then you pin a tag to what kind of question it is. And when we looked at the data from 3 classrooms, we looked at whether that improved their learning, what kind of scaffolds they used, and things like that. So all of that was interesting to the teacher because the teachers that was a tool for critical thinking development. So the use of scaffolds and who talked to whom made sense to them and was beneficial. To me as a researcher, I had another question there, which was, well, at the same time as the teacher is focusing on the learning, I was interested in what is the social context that's on top of this learning. And so basically, the contexts that to me were less equitable actually produced better learning for the students in them. And so I was interested in understanding how do we make environments more equitable, but a teacher is interested in figuring out, well, how do I support critical thinking better, right? So these are 2 different goals, And so when we ask about the benefit of something, at the end of the day, it depends on who's looking, right? So if I were to look at that data, I would think, well, I want to solve the equity problem because I think the implications are like that, and I care about addressing that. But a teacher who's concerned about critical thinking and understands the role of that particular learning outcome would focus on that instead. And so to me, the benefit is not this prescriptive thing. It's like, we just give you what is happening. It's this negotiation between the user, whoever that user is, and decisions that they find valuable for where they are situated. I think that the biggest challenge right now is that technology gets into classrooms so fast, and it is very intimidating to a lot of people. And so that when I talk to pre-service teachers, I find that they have this a little bit of a shock effect, and they get fixated, if you like, on technology aspect. So technology doesn't allow me to do this, data shows that. And these are not very productive mindsets, because in that technocentric view of data and technology in the classroom, pedagogical aspects, they kind of become secondary to what data can do or technology can do. And so I think that the productive adoption of technology is when stakeholders, such as teachers, administrators, principals, parents, learners, understand that technology is just a part of the ecosystem of tools. And so that part has to work with all the other parts. And so unless the stakeholders think about learning analytics that way, we're going to be facing a lot of negative implications of the use of data and technology, because it ignores sort of the holistic view of how technology should be an integral part of basically a developmental process. There is also an aspect of digital literacy. Digital literacy in its broadest sense, not only being able to interpret whatever information is being presented to you, but being able to question the ability of technology to capture what matters to you. And so again, this, I kind of touched upon this already, is that the moment that the stakeholders think that technology is going to solve everything, the moment that that positive effect stops. So unless there is a critical engagement process with what data offer and what they don't offer, that's the biggest challenge. But that literacy is not, it shouldn't be taken for, and it isn't taken for granted. I mean, a lot of colleagues at C3L also are working with these processes and trying to understand what are the barriers or how to support stakeholders in school to engage meaningfully with technology and data that they produce. I don't think it's advice, but it's a question that I always send back to my students who ask, well, I can't do this with this tool. Then the question is always the same. What's your learning outcome and what do you value in your teaching process? And then make technology work for that, rather than figure out what technology does and how you can make yourself work for technology. I think right now learning analytics is very much focused on solving things. And there are good reasons for that. So we're looking at assessments, complex assessments, assessments of critical thinking, creativity, working in teams, because technology can basically collect data that's otherwise difficult for us to collect, to understand these. So learning analytics is working within this space. And then another set of things that sort of learning analytics is concerned with is this adoption and tensions between the pros and cons and the trade-offs. So there are people who are situated outside of educational technology domain are very critical of the negative impacts of surveillance in classrooms, and those are very valid points, but then the questions that are not being as prevalently addressed are, well, what are the benefits, and are we depriving the learners of the benefits by focusing on the negative impacts of surveillance? And so I think that there's this other interesting area of figuring out these tensions and the trade-offs and finding use cases for learning analytics that benefit learners and maintain some integrity that's relevant to that context, to the ethical considerations that need to be taken in place. So that adoption is a big question at the moment. The assessment of competencies and sort of soft skills, if you like, is another one. And then, of course, all kind of adaptive learning and the use of AI, so integration of dynamic technologies in teaching is another emerging area, and there's going to be more of that, I think, in the years to come, and the focus will remain because that will be one of the main features of technologies that get adopted in these learning settings. I hope that we will be asking less of does X impact Y and more of why does X impact Y. So right now, as I said, it's very much solution-oriented, trying to fix things that people see need for. And so it's a little bit reactive, I think. The field is a little bit reactive at the moment as to things that pop up in the classrooms with technology being brought in. And I hope that it will be a little bit more proactive and sort of responding to what may come towards it. So slower approaches and things like teachers being more integral to designing problems and solutions. Because if you imagine, for instance, if there is a tool that a teacher uses from day to day, from year to year, let's say there is no change in that tool, and so the teacher is exposed to the same data on a very regular basis, then that becomes a lot more meaningful because the teacher has a more holistic view of understanding the problem, understanding the context, and understanding the data, while learning analytics researchers always are privy only to parts of that. So I hope that that will also become more mainstream, and that then we will be able to ask questions as to, well, but why these things happen, rather than what do I do to fix this?